It is now time for the first panel discussion of the day, in which we deliberate on the possibilities and challenges for the Indian space sector. May I please invite my colleague and moderator for the session, Konark Bhandari, to come up on stage. He's Associate Fellow in the Technology and Society Program in Carnegie, India. Also, please welcome Shashank Saxena, Deputy Director in Space, T. Victor Joseph, Associate Scientific Secretary, Indian Space Research Organization, Awais Ahmed, Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Pixel, and Susmita Mohanty, Director General of Spaceport, Sarabhai. Konark, all yours.
Hi, good morning, everyone. And we'll be talking today about InSpace and the role it has played in incubating the Indian space ecosystem. I just want to set some context here to start off things. So space activities in India have largely been the sole preserve for the longest time of the Indian Space Research Organization, ISRO, better known as ISRO. And this has had significant payoffs in the form of India becoming one of the 6 spacefaring nations in the world. However, at the same time, there's a bit of a mismatch because the private sector has not grown correspondingly. And the reasons offered for this are various, from basically restrictive government controls to a lack of funding, to even the procurement system being set up in a way where it doesn't encourage the vendors to go and participate in the international market. So those are essentially the challenges. But what's encouraging is that in the last 2.5 years, the government has announced the setting up of this body called InSpace, which is the Indian Space Promotion and Authorization Center. Essentially, it will be a regulator of sorts, which will seek to handhold what they're calling NGEs, non-governmental enterprises, and get them to sort of play a larger role in the space ecosystem. So with that, we have a fascinating panel with us today. And I would just like to start by asking Shashank of InSpace to offer his opening remarks.
I think it's on. Very good morning to the esteemed gathering. From the vision of Sarabhai of utilizing space for societal benefit to the present government's boost to the private industry to have more participation in the space sector. In June 2020, the government announced phenomenal next generation space reforms, which led to formation of an autonomous body called InSpace. Soon a high-level committee was formed in ISRO, which started accepting the proposals from private industry. And with the appointment of chairman in InSpace in 21, a specific committee was formed, which was focusedly working on resolving all the requirements and making them to meet their purposes through various ISRO centers. After that, there was a specific Gazette notification in October 21, which actually mandated the specific activities under the domain of InSpace, making it bring out its role in 4 major verticals like promoter, enabler, authorizer, and supervisor. So as of now, we have got more than 150 proposals, and we are working with the 3 directorates. There is a technical directorate, there is a program management authorization directorate, and there is a promotion directorate, and a legal and administration directorate.
Shashank, I want to basically follow up that with a different question. You mentioned that you've received 150 proposals so far, right? But can you break it down into which verticals are seeing the most traction? Which particular verticals in the space sector do you see the most demand for in terms of hand-holding?
Basically, as of now, out of these many numbers of proposals, we are finding that almost 70% of the requirements are in upstream, and remaining 30% are in downstream. And in upstream, it is mainly into the satellite development, the support system they require for testing, characterization, and utilization of cost-intensive facilities of ISRO through InSpace.
Okay. Dr. Mohanty, I want to bring you in at this point. You're an entrepreneur who's had success establishing companies, in jurisdictions in cities like Vienna, San Francisco, and Bangalore. So clearly, you're someone who's got the lay of the land when it comes to, what it takes to set up a successful space ecosystem. I want to ask you, what do you feel about two things? First of all, how do you feel about the new space ecosystem in India with the announcement of the reforms? And if you can possibly follow that up with the procurement practices followed by ISRO, or maybe in the US and the EU, because that seems to play a major role when it comes to incubating new space companies. So over to you.
Thanks, Konark. So I think the new space ecosystem in India, if you ask me, really began about a decade ago with companies like Earth to Orbit, Team Indus. That was sort of the early arrivals of the scene. And I had already, before moving back to India in 2008, I had started my first space small company in San Francisco. Back then, the word startup didn't exist. This was the year 2001. And my Vienna company, I co-founded it in 2005, so it's more than 17 years old. So if I look at the new space ecosystem in India say a decade ago and now, after the announcement of the government's intention to liberalize the Indian space economy, I think there is a huge difference in the way new space companies are perceived within ISRO. So earlier we had to really persuade, push, and with all the effort that we would put in, we had very little support from ISRO. So now the thing has completely changed in terms of how these companies are perceived. They are looked at as allies instead of competitors. And there's a lot of, there is still, we can, improve in terms of speed of responses. And I think government being an anchor customer is yet to happen. So if you look at the American ecosystem, for example, a small space company can easily apply for what is called a Small Business Innovation Research Grant. Phase one, you can get up to $125,000 to prove your technology. And phase two, you can easily get up to $750,000 to $1 million to commercialize your technology, right? And the proposal writing format for these kind of grants is very, very simple. It's simplified to an extent that it makes it very easy for small companies to apply and even possibly get these grants. In Europe, by contrast, you have something called the European Commission Edge 2020 program, where the European Union together puts out about 80 billion euros every couple of years. So my Vienna company has not only benefited from contracts with the European Space Agency, but also we have, for projects, very complex projects, where we design and build prototypes of space habitats, of rovers, of spacesuits, we can get anywhere from 1 million to 4 million euros over 3 years to prototype our designs. So by contrast, now let's look at the Indian ecosystem. So the government grants that are currently available are in the order of about, maybe 10 lakhs, which, if you ask me, is an amount that an entrepreneur can easily raise with friends and family. So the first major shift in terms of funding has come from the venture capitalists. If you look at the money that's been raised by Pixel, Avice is on stage, look at Skyroot, Agnicool, Bellatrix, anywhere from 11 million to I think about 67 million is what we're looking at, with several rounds of fundraising. If you compare it to Skybox Imaging, which was the first American company in the Valley to raise venture capital funds, they raised $90 million for just 2 demo satellites. And the irony is that Skybox couldn't even find the talent in the Valley to build those 2 demo satellites. So they outsourced it to Loral, the big space company right across the street. And Skybox was my first launch client in India, right? So just the sheer quantum of funding that is still missing in India is going to slow down our new space ecosystem, which we really want to accelerate. So I think we really need to look at that. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Kunal.
So you mentioned the lack of the government being an anchor customer in India, right? But that's more of a role for ISRO to play as opposed to IN-SPACe. So at this point, I'd like to pivot to Dr. Joseph of ISRO and ask you what has been the biggest experience of ISRO since the announcement of the space reforms? I mean, you're essentially going to be, I'm assuming, transitioning to an agency which does more R&D and research work as opposed to the commanding heights of the space ecosystem. What do you see as the roadmap for ISRO now, given the announcement of the space reforms?
Now, to answer to your first questions regarding the procurement and the anchor customer role, what I have to tell is one important point to note is even before the space reforms itself, there were more than 500 plus industries participating in the Indian space program through ISRO. And if you see a typical launch vehicle or a satellite, more than 80% of this comes through industry. And only 20% value addition takes place in-house inside ISRO. So, but what is important is it was more of a component realization or a subsystem realization in nature, not as an end-to-end solution. And that is what we are looking for now. But then the space sector, as we know, especially the upstream side, the realization of a launch vehicle or a satellite, it is a high-risk domain, as you may know, and it is also highly capital-intensive. So how ISRO can handhold its knowledge as well as its facilities for helping the private sector is one thing what we are thinking. And in these lines, if you see, NCIL has recently entered into a consortium within the industries for end-to-end realization of PSLV. And also, NCIL has now entering into a technology agreement for realization of IMS-01 bus. And regarding this anchor customer role, what ISRO is mooting now is, especially if you see the European constellation like Landsat, Copernicus or USA Landsat, whether we also can become an anchor customer, especially in the EO constellation. So we go through Consolidated Fund of India, whether we can place order on this satellite builders to realize satellites, so that ecosystem grows, as well as the application side. Once the satellites are put in place, the value-added products automatically come into place. That we are mooting the idea, and we are trying to bring out some kind of proposal for that.
Right. So, Dr. Mohanty, trying to stay on the topic of procurement, I think Spaceport Sarabhai had recently come out with a report about a month ago on, I guess, how can entrepreneurs look at areas outside of India, or rather, what are the factors pulling people to establish their, I guess, business presence outside of India? Would you like to share your takeaways from that report in brief?
Yes, I can do that. So I think the report, the researcher was a postdoc from IIM Kozhikode, and he interviewed 10 different companies' founders. Some of these companies have their companies in Singapore, Netherlands, the United States, and there were a couple of them who had their companies incorporated both in India and abroad. So there were three kinds of factors. One were input-driven factors. When I'm saying input-driven, we're talking about better access to capital and better access to resources. So I think the creation of IN-SPACe has, to some extent, is now helping with better access to resources, such as ISRO's facilities for environmental testing, right? The other factors were process-driven. So one of them is clarity in the space policy regime. So we still are, as a nation, we still don't have a robust space policy framework. We're still grappling with it because you need that in order to support the reforms, the intended reforms. We don't even have legislation in Parliament, a kind of bill that will then authorize, all involved parties to adhere to this new framework, which is, again, it's still being worked on, if you ask me. Secondly, the space startup ecosystem is very mature in countries like the United States, even Israel, I would say, Europe, whereas we are just starting out. IN-SPACe was announced in July of 2020. It took the government 17 months to appoint a board chairman. And now finally, all of the 4 directorates have their directors. So it's taken a long time from the announcement to actually getting IN-SPACe up and running in an efficient manner. So the other countries have that advantage. They've already had a very conducive ecosystem for the last 20 years. Encouragement from space agencies, I think, is a big thing. Back in the day, you would never hear a positive statement from the space agency, say about Team Indus being in the top 3 of 26 teams from around the world, competing for the Google Lunar X Prize, because that was not part of the government mandate. But today you are starting to see that our space agency is openly encouraging startups. Then there are output-driven factors, and one of them is better access to markets, better access to clients, and the government being an anchor customer.
Right. Awais, I'd like to come to you now. So, Sushmita Mohanty spoke about how, a lot of the mature jurisdictions have processes in place which allow these companies to prosper. So one thing which I know has been on the wish list of many companies in India is like a single nodal, single window nodal agency. And you have dealt extensively with both ISRO and InSpace. What has your experience been like so far when it comes to dealing with them? Do you feel it's a true blue single window clearance system or anything else?
I think we're about on the way there, right? So when we started in 2019, at that point in time, there was no policy. The announcement came a year later. So we have seen it before, we have seen it during, and we have seen it after. And there's definitely been progress, right? There's no two ways around that. With the setting up of InSpace now, Anand, the satellite that we launched last Saturday, was actually the first private satellite that InSpace authorized to be tested at an ISRO facility in Bangalore, which we did. So things really have moved that way, and all that happened within the span of a couple of months. As was mentioned earlier here, the first and foremost thing that needs to be done is to bring out the final policy draft and actually put it out to the world. It's been in draft stage for quite a few months, and of course it takes a lot of deliberation from across different departments, but having that makes it clear for everyone that this is possible, this is not possible, and this is the timeline that it generally takes, this is the cost that it might you might incur if you're trying to either launch rockets or launch satellites, and if you want to take insurance and whatnot. So having that is first and foremost. And InSpace is that nodal agency that is supposed to be the single window or single point of contact where private companies reach out to, and then the internal coordination happens from the back. Now we've been engaging with InSpace for ever since it came up, and things have moved, but where I think a lot more clarity is needed is how the processes work where there's inter-ministry or inter-department communications, right? So for example, if you have to get a communication license for a satellite, we have to still, go to WPC. And if you have to get foreign direct investment in, that has to still go through the Department of Space approval. If you're looking at exports and things like that, again, all of that essentially ends up coming to either Department of Space or InSpace, and there's no clarity as to which agency has to reach out to whom. So I would say, compared to 2019, yes, we are absolutely sort of miles ahead in terms of where we were. Things are moving. The number 150 up from probably 10 startups that were there 3 years ago speaks to that fact. But of course, in the next year to 2 years, a lot of work to do to actually set the process in place, have a clear timeline and transparency, which I think is coming, but yeah, of course, that could be accelerated.
Sure. Dr. Mohanty, I'm going to have to come back to you on this topic. So the view seems to be that the setting up of InSpace, even though it was announced in 2020, actually happened this year in June, right? And there is still no space activities bill, there is still no space policy. So my question is, the activities bill is something which has to be pushed through the parliament, right? But the space policy is a union cabinet instrument. That does not need to be pushed through the parliament. So
Right.
what do you think would be done to push the space policy out at least? Maybe that can come out first, maybe that can provide a roadmap to people as to how the space activities bill will look like, but what do you think could be done to push it out faster, Abid?
Yeah, we were just talking about this in the speakers lounge as to when the policy will come out. So I think the policy will be the first thing to definitely come out.
Okay.
And the bill and the act will definitely follow, but of course that has to go through a longer process. I mean, it's not as simple as it sounds, of course, because space, you like it or not, is a very geopolitical asset. It's a critical technology, right? There's a lot of things that do not come into any of the defense or intelligence related use cases, but a lot of them do. They're in the class that you call dual use. Even if you don't intend to use it for those purposes, they could be used for those purposes, which means that there's going to be a lot of coordination and approvals and buy-in mainly required from not only the Department of Space, but Ministry of Home Affairs, Ministry of External Affairs, and a bunch of other things. And getting that in place and having that buy-in, of course, takes time. So I think at the policy level, we are almost at the finishing line here. The draft, There have been about 2 or 3 different versions of the drafts that have gone around, and finally, I think we're at a stage where it should come out any day now. Of course, the final date can't be said for sure, and then it'll be followed up with the bill and activity. So hopefully it'll come out soon, but it's been quite long delayed now. That from a startup perspective, we would have liked it to have been a year ago.
Right. I
So
just want to
Kunal, if I may
sorry.
add,
Yes, please.
if
Yeah,
I
please
may
go
add
ahead.
here.
Yeah.
So just a few months ago, Switzerland, which is a very, very small spacefaring nation, they have a very modest program. They wrote their first space policy document in 2008, and they are now in the process of renewing it. And they invited 8 different experts from around the world and we sat through, I was one of those 8, and we sat through long, very well thought out hearings where we were giving them our opinion on a number of aspects that would help them sort of edit and create a new space policy, this coming year. Similarly, if you look at a small space program, I mean, Australia is a very, very new entrant into the space world. They have a fledgling space program, and their space policy making was led by Dr. Stephen Freeland, who's an extremely well-experienced space lawyer who has worked in the international space law scene for decades. So he was leading the effort. And if you look at the methodology that Dr. Freeland used to come up with Australia's space policy, it's commendable. So I think India's space policy making or writing really began with ISRO's scientists. And one cannot expect scientists to write policy, right? So I think NITI Aayog and DOS should bring in experienced space law and policy experts to draft policy, because the language that needs to go into policy, the kind of international considerations that need to go into policy making, there are so many international treaties, and there are ongoing international issues like space debris, ASAT testing and what have you. India needs to take an approach which is led by experienced lawyers and experienced policymakers. The scientists and the industry can then be brought in for hearings, and their stakeholder input should be then incorporated into it. So I think how you approach the choreography of policymaking is very important. And that's something Department of Space and NITI Aayog should look into. It's not just about drafting something and getting it approved.
Right. So that was more about the policy front. Now, if I can pivot to Shashank and talk about the aspect of financing, which has been a big constraint for many space companies in India. Is it time to think about coming out with something which allows or rather encourages manufacturing in space, like a PLI kind of scheme, or do you think that's being too ambitious? Because the entire point of a PLI scheme is to make the industry more cost competitive, right? But given that cost constraints in India, or rather cost manufacturing in space in India is already quite competitive, do you think India would benefit from a PLI type of scheme for space companies in India, or?
I would say that with the progress that we are seeing in the startups and the way they are maturing, I think the time will come where the government would certainly look into it and may come up with certain policies which are incentive to them in terms of funding.
Okay, so tied to this is the issue of FDI policy in the space sector, and there's no clarity as to what is the exact ceiling, what is allowed through the government route, what is allowed through the automatic route. So Dr. Joseph, would you have any thoughts on this issue of FDI policy? When can we expect clarity on this, or what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. We are also in the process of seeing how these policies can be more towards encouraging the space sector, and we are looking forward with optimism on how this FDI investment can further boost the space sector. And currently, as you said, it's not very clearly written. It's almost like one line is there in the FDI policy where it states that 100% government route in the. So what we are trying to do now is we have to see it in each sector, whether it is launch vehicle, whether it is satellite or applications or ground segment, each sector, how much it can be through the government route or how much it can be through the automatic route. So some kind of opinions we have brought, and we are trying to bring it into the policy. That's right.
Okay. Yeah. Awais, if I can just turn to you. You spoke about geopolitics being a very critical part of space tech. As you try to enter more markets, right, do you feel it's an advantage being associated with ISRO within space? Do they help you push into new markets, when it comes to sort of serving various industries like, maybe precision farming, maybe mining, so on and so forth? What has your view been so far, or what has your experience been so far dealing with ISRO, and is that a big asset when it comes to pushing into overseas markets?
I think the role of ISRO right now has been as a mentor of sorts on the technical aspects of what we need to do, right? I mean, ISRO in the end is a scientific and research organization. The expertise lies in building rockets, building satellites, and what to do, what not to do with regards to the tech, which they have been very helpful in. InSpace is responsible for the regulatory aspects within the country. So to answer your question, no, I think in terms of our go-to-market and outreach in markets outside of India, that's predominantly been only a Pixel effort. So we started in India, of course, but ever since 2019, we have set up a separate US entity. We'll be setting up a separate European entity just because the market is there. And we need to have certain local entities to be able to engage with the customers there because from a tech standpoint, you can build things here. There's a supplier ecosystem, but what you do not have is a large customer ecosystem for sort of anything, which means that for any private space company to thrive beyond just government contracts, you will have to go beyond the boundaries of the country and get customers from there. That could be for launch vehicles hosting international payloads. That could be for us selling satellite imagery. But being from a country that has been spacefaring and is considered one of the space powerhouses, one of the top 5 space agencies in the world, obviously has its benefits. People have a lot more trust. They're willing to engage more, and they know that if you're working and building with hardware and you're testing it in the same facilities that ISRO is testing their satellites and spacecraft at, or if you're using the same supplier ecosystem that ISRO has been using, because these have been space proven, these have gone up to space and worked, that obviously adds credibility, and that has added credibility to us as well. We manufacture our satellites in Bangalore. We've tested it through ISRO testing facilities. So that's been helpful. But in terms of actual business, that's something that every company has to do for themselves. No one can really help you in that because every company has its own nuances, has its own strengths, has its own weaknesses. So not on that front, but on the technical and regulatory aspects, yes, there's definitely been help.
I do agree with the point that you would have to forge your own way forward being a private company. But shouldn't India consider possibly thinking of exploring being a part of the Artemis Accords? That is a great opportunity to partner with a group of like-minded nations who are planning a mission to the moon to land a person of color and a woman on the moon by 2024, 2025. Wouldn't a company like Pixel benefit from being a part of a coalition of enterprises which form the core group of those nations which form the Artemis Accords?
Yeah, I think what can be definitely helpful is for India to have certain strategic partnerships with countries that it has partnerships with, right? For example, the IDEX program has recently come up, can give up to 10 crores worth of funding matched with funding that a startup comes up with, which is a significant amount. But to open up the access to a lot more markets, an example could be that IDEX could work with the Defense Innovation Unit, which is the equivalent agency in the US, to come up with joint programs where both US and India companies can coordinate together to have a better relationship there. The Artemis Accords would have been a big one. I completely understand, and we should as a country have an independent pathway towards space and not be dependent on any other space agency, for sure, right? Having our own space station, having our own access to space is very important because space is going to be one of the places where the geopolitical battle is going to be fought out. So having that individual pathway and strategy is very important, but at the same time, ensuring that we are parts of those coalition which can help us leapfrog into certain things would be helpful. When Vikram Sarabhai set up ISRO, this is what he said: we can't really do exactly the same things that other agencies have done. We have to leapfrog to where they are and reach a point where we can be on par, and that can be done by being part of the Artemis program. A very specific example would be Team Indus, was the name that was taken earlier in the panel, and they were looking at sending a lunar lander to the moon, of course, due to funding issues that could not happen. But when they set up a sister entity, Orbit Beyond, in the US, and that won a contract under the commercial lunar program that NASA was providing, that contract had to be taken away because there was an outroar in the US that the money is going towards an Indian company and not really towards US companies. Probably if there could have been some level of cooperation there, that as JAXA is a part of the Artemis program, as ESA is part of the Artemis program, if ISRO was some part there, that probably could have been something good. So of course, having an own independent pathway is something that I definitely support and we should have, but at the same time, having coalitions which not only provide access to funding, but also customers where the products that are being built by startups can be sold would be important to have.
A follow-up question on that.
Kunal, can I add something to this
Sure, please
topic
comment.
here? Yeah, okay. So I think Artemis, so I worked in the US for about 12 years. And if you look at the Artemis Accords, the problem from a space think tank point of view or from a law and policy point of view is that Artemis Accords is being led by the United States. And it's a series of bilateral agreements that the United States is signing with allies, right? And United States Congress in 2015, under the Obama regime, unilaterally passed a legislation which allows American companies to go to other celestial objects, bring back, regolith, rocks, what have you, and they can own them and sell them. So this is the kind of unilateral legislation which makes things problematic. So Artemis Accords, if you look at the international space law circles, is being looked at as what you could call minilateralism, right? So I think what we need is multilateralism, and India has, I think India's policy to be an independent player has deep historical roots. I was born in the early 70s, and my dad was one of the early recruits when Sarabhai started hiring in the late 60s. And I've seen the Indian space program, the geopolitical hurdles that we had to cross to even have our own space program or our own atomic energy program. I think it's important that India, like China, have its own human space program, have its own GPS constellation and so on. We cannot afford to rely on other countries. So I think India is treading carefully, and I think that is the right way to do, even with the Artemis Accords. We can't just sign up accords that the US is leading in a minilateral way rather than a multilateral way. So I think I support India's position in going the independent route because we have to be careful internationally speaking, both in terms of laws and how it benefits or constrains us in the future.
Right. I just want. Oh, right. Obviously, you want to come in?
Just to quickly add there, the point was exactly that we should have an independent pathway forward, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that we are following what they're following. The US will have legislation that will benefit US companies. Luxembourg has a similar legislation that says that any Luxembourg entity can own that, right? India can bring up a similar legislation. So I think just being a part of this doesn't necessarily mean we're agreeing to everything that they're agreeing. A very good example would be what ISRO and JPL are doing with the NISAR program, right? ISRO is working with JPL on creating a joint SAR project, and those pockets can be created out. At the same time, not compromising on the individuality and the independence of the space program and strategy, there can still be pockets, not only with NASA, but with JAXA, with European Space Agency, that pockets can be created out where not only government-to-government interaction, but private-to-private and private-to-government interaction can be enabled.
Right. I'm sorry if I'm harping
Yeah,
on this point.
I think I agree with what Avais said. And I remember there's a new thing called Quad, which is India, Australia, United States, and Japan. I think these new geopolitical constructs should also be leveraged to allow our companies to access these other markets and vice versa.
Dr. Mohanty, I just want to, press upon this point of a space station. I understand India's planning on coming out, or rather planning on having its space station in the lower Earth orbit by 2030, right? And in the meantime, I think other nations might partner and then come up with their own space station at that time. So by sort of delaying the inevitable, are we not sort of foreclosing ourselves off to the opportunity which comes to being a part of a coalition of countries which can partner for a multilateral space station?
I think participating in Artemis Accords can be done, provided we have a bilateral agreement with the lead here, the United States, that is written in a manner that should not constrain India. So I think I wouldn't say that we should not participate in Artemis, but we should do it on our own terms. And the United States should let us do it in our own terms and not constrain us in any way. I'm not saying we should not cooperate internationally. We should. We absolutely should. But we have to make sure that the provisos are in a way written. After moving back to India, I spent 3 years meeting diplomats in the US State Department, in the US Trade Department, and the Ministry of External Affairs in Delhi. So I spent 3 years meeting diplomats on both sides to overcome the existing 1998 US embargo, which still exists, by the way, when India conducted nuclear tests. That was the year I started working for Boeing in Southern California. So I've seen what you have to go through in terms of export control, ITAR. I don't know if everybody is familiar with ITAR. It's a Cold War regime for export control that the US hasn't done much to reform. So I think I am all for international cooperation. However, we need to make sure that the bilateral agreements are done in a way that India can still move on. And remember, Kunal, what we will do in low Earth orbit is not going to be the way the US or Russia did it. For us, it's a test bed. We don't have to stay in low Earth orbit for 20 years or 50 years. We can go to the moon, but being in low Earth orbit is a very important test technology demonstration that India has to do and should do.
Sure. Dr. Joseph, you want to comment?
Yeah, as you know, we already have an approved program for sending humans to space. And that is going on, and that we are now, the current time frame is around 24-25 time frame, we are planning humans to space. That's not building a human station, but then sending humans to space into low Earth orbit. And as you know, there are multiple collaborations internationally for this space program, for this human space flight program, which includes collaborations with Russia, and it has astronaut training has already been completed. Preliminary level of training with astronauts at Russia has been completed. We have collaborations with CNES, and we have collaborations with many other countries. So, irrespective of Artemis program, that's a policy decision. We have collaborations with multiple countries, including USA for the NISAR project. We have friendly countries like France, Russia, Japan, and now 61 countries are actively participating with India with respect to the space program.
Now, this is not a question regarding India's policy architecture. It's more about G2G partnerships, because most of space is still, I guess, conducted G2G. Could it be possible to expand on the US-Indian Civil Joint Working Group, Civilian Space Joint Working Group, and perhaps allow commercial enterprises on both parts to explore synergies? Dr. Mohanty, do you think that's a feasible option to take? Maybe if you're not going to be a part of the Artemis Accords, perhaps we can convert the existing joint working group we have into a shop or like a talk shop or something more than a talk shop where commercial enterprises can interact and then take it forward.
Yeah, I wouldn't rule out participating in the Artemis Accords, like I said, but it has to be done under the right, provisos and clauses. Coming to your other question, I think, yes, absolutely. And I think Awais has also kind of emphasized that point, that India, through its various geopolitical constructs, whether it's G20 or Quad or, the working groups, to be honest, I've been in the space world for 25 years, and working groups are a great place for people to come and discuss things, but nothing much comes out of working groups. So what we need to do is at a government level, at a Niti Aayog, at a Department of Space level, at a Ministry of External Affairs level, whether it's Japan or France or the United States or Russia, we need to have more active collaboration. What we have is very low level, very limited collaboration. We can do a lot more. And by doing that, we can open up our countries in a way that our businesses can also benefit. So I think that hasn't happened. Again, we need a policy framework for that, which is missing, if you ask me, to open up international, in terms of business, in terms of technology development. It's not happening yet.
At this point, I'd like to request our audience members to be ready with their questions. I think we're nearing the end of our session, so please be ready with your questions. I'll come to you in about 5 minutes. Awais, if I can just pivot to you again. As ISRO eventually retreats into being an organization focusing on the cutting edge R&D, and I guess that means that New Space India Limited will have fewer assets to commercialize, and that's where Indian startups can eventually come in. Do you think there's a case to be made? So for example, if somebody wants to purchase a full vertical stack of Indian space services, be it a rocket launch, a satellite, and space application services, do you think there's a case until we have our own SpaceX, until we have our own Blue Origin, for InSpace to sort of market all the space enterprises in India as one bundle? Do you think that's possible? Or do you think that's like a commercially attractive option?
So I think in terms of what ISRO has been doing today, the predominant commercialization has been on the PSLV rockets and the GSLV rockets, right? They're the workhorses of the Indian space industry, and they're really good rockets, very reliable, haven't faced a whole lot of problems, PSLV, at least in the past many years, right? And international customers still come to that, and there is a need for having Indian launch vehicles that can put Indian spacecraft into space on a moment's notice, and that's something that only ISRO can do today. So up until the point that we have our own SpaceXs or our own satellite companies that can do this, that transition has to be gradual, and eventually I think the economics of capitalism will play themselves out, right? The whole point of a private enterprise is that they can move faster, they can move cheaper, and that they'll be able to take up this mantle. If you look at the US, or if you look at Europe right now, the rockets that they use to send stuff to space are not their own. They're either the United Launch Alliance or SpaceX or now Rocket Lab. And in Europe, Arianespace is done by a whole host of the same subcontractors that they sort of engage with. So hopefully in 5 to 10 years, we will be at a position where the commercial launch procurement, the commercial satellites, the communication satellites are all taken up by the private sector, and not because those are being handed over to the private sector. And that's just because now that the space is opened up just by the virtue of how startups and companies can move faster, can move cheaper, that's where that will move, which means that it's good that the budget that we have going towards space can actually be utilized towards the cutting edge work and sending cutting edge missions to outer space, such as the Aditya L1 mission and other missions. ISRO was also a space agency that was set up in a very different way to other space agencies. When Vikram Sarabhai helped set it up in the 1960s, it was to help build self-reliance in the country with regards to space technology, versus in the case of NASA, it was not so much that, it was more in terms of what can we push the boundaries towards, right? And that has continued today because of a lack of other options. But now that private companies can come and fill up that void, and there'll be many more of them, there'll be no single point of failure. It won't be just one organization doing it and just one source of funding that will be coming there. It'll be many different companies doing many different kinds of things, and you won't have single points of failure. It'll be a vibrant ecosystem. So I would say, as of now, yes, it will continue. It should continue as is, because there exists no other full-scale commercial viable options. But in the next 5 years, as the market dynamics themselves sort it out, at a certain point, yes, ISRO will start stepping back.
Okay. So Shashank, you want to come in?
What we are also observing is that most of the startups are in their incubation stage, and space technologies actually require stringent quality standards, and the development process for bringing up any innovative idea to a prototype level requires a long and costly development cycle. And before a company comes out from that valley of death kind of scenario, till then in space, through resources of ISRO, it makes sense for all the startups to reach to that level. And that is what InSpace is actually doing, building up its own technical center, mainly an incubation center for startups to carry out a complete range of activities from design to development, then testing and integration, and leading to rollout of the complete payload at Ahmedabad. So what I mean to say that, yes, we are on that path, and InSpace has complete realization and is working towards that direction only.
Do we have any audience questions? Does anyone wish to walk up to the microphones to the side? I think we have someone coming up, yeah. Please introduce yourself and just address the panelists who you want to ask the question to.
Sure. Hi, my name is Vartika. I'm a young ambassador from the Indian School of Public Policy, and my question is directed to T. Victor Joseph. Since we know that this summit is about the geopolitics of technology, and our Prime Minister calls out for an era of women-led development, so I would like to shift gears a bit and ask how ISRO plans to portray as an instrument of soft power to the world, because we recently saw the images of ISRO MOM, Mars Orbiter mission.
Yes, the geopolitical situation, as we know, is something which is continuously evolving. And also, now we are in a multipolar world. So how the different stakeholders can make use of the kind of situations that will be presented before itself. So one thing with regard to ISRO, what I have to say is you have seen the recent launch of OneWeb constellation satellites. It is something which has arisen out of the current geopolitical situations. And we are able to take advantage of that situation, and then we are able to launch those satellites using from India and using our own launch vehicle. So these kind of situations we would like to take advantage of, and we will be pursuing that.
Thank you.
Konark, can I respond to the women in space angle of the question, please?
Sure, Dr. Mahdi, yeah.
So when I started out in the late 90s, so like I said, I was born around the same time ISRO was incorporated. And when my father retired as the Deputy Director of Space Applications Center in Ahmedabad, he had a co-deputy director who was Rastogi, Dr. Rastogi, who was a woman. So since my early days of exposure to the Indian space program and then having lived in 4 different countries, I can say that ISRO has always had an excellent gender balance in terms of, women scientists working for ISRO. And back in the late 90s, I would say NASA and ISRO had the best gender ratio. And even today, despite having a great gender ratio, ISRO has not been able to have, we've had amazing ISRO women scientists. They have led entire satellite projects. They have led the LVP, the Launch Vehicle Program Office. But however, ISRO has not had a single woman head any of the major ISRO centers. And certainly we've not had a ISRO chairperson as a woman. So I think ISRO should make the best of the fact that they have such a great gender ratio. And in terms of wielding soft power and branding, I think it's high time ISRO also think of appointing women heads of centers and possibly even consider a chairperson to be a woman.
I believe we'll go to the gentleman on the right.
Hello, I'm GTS Young Ambassador. I'm from IIIT Bangalore. My name is Rijul. So I had 2 questions actually. One is, so for example, if we take the Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of the United States, it allows for programs like PRISM and Upstream, wherein domestic spying and a sort of Orwellian state's nightmare arises. So what's to prevent that from happening and an unholy alliance forming between private parties and the government and resulting in a sort of Orwellian state? And the other question I had was, it's a very short question, should man or machines be exploring space? I know it's not directly related to this, but I'd love to know the panel's thoughts.
Dr. Mohanty, you want to take a stab at this?
Yeah, I think the last question is right up my alley. I've spent 15 years designing things for human space exploration. So whether man or machine, the answer is very clear to those of us who've been in this space, that it has to be a combination of humans and robotics. So it has to be a combination of biospheres and robospheres. The reason is what humans can do in terms of dexterity, thinking, problem solving while being on a mission, because a mission is a very complex affair, whether you are, going to low Earth orbit or you're going to, Moon or Mars. So I think humans have to be part of the equation, but it has to be supported by robots in a big way. For example, let's take the Moon. The Moon is a very, very treacherous place. The 2 very difficult situations we have on the Moon, one is lunar regolith, which is like loose lunar dust. It's unlike Earth, there are no weathering forces on the Moon, right? So lunar dust is very, very sharp like glass, and it gets into everything. It gets into the hermetic sealing of the spacesuits, into the mechanical parts of the moon buggy. If you bring it into the habitat, you should see one of the photographs of Eugene Cernan, the last Apollo mission, who he landed and did sorties on the Moon. When he came back into the lunar module, he was looking like a coal miner. So I think long-term lunar presence, we will only have a limited number of humans on the Moon. What we will need is a good robotic presence on the Moon to support, limited human presence. The other problem on the Moon is lack of an atmosphere and therefore direct exposure to galactic radiation, which is cancerous. And as space architects, the only solutions we have known to us is building bunkers of lunar regolith or building walls of water. So it's very complicated. So we need both. And I think it's not a question of either or. Over to you, Kunal.
Over to you. Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Good morning. My name is Abhishek. I'm a GTS Young Ambassador and a scholar at Indian School of Public Policy. In the absence of space policy, the private players in India often, face procedural ambiguity. So until the policy comes out, what steps could be taken so that this minimum, they don't have to face procedural ambiguity, and also how would it encourage more private players to come and join the workforce and work together?
Shashank, I think I'll pass this question to you. This is basically asking what's going to happen in the absence of a space policy.
Yeah, see, basically, in absence of a space policy, we are actually catering to the requirements of interacting with different heads in the government, whether it is for frequency filing, ITU, WPC. So we help NGEs to direct them to the right people. Even in terms of other, say, departments. So we are trying to cater to their requirement in terms of whether it is resources required or whether it is guidance. So in space is at the moment trying to do all those things.
I think I'll add one more.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Even in the absence of space policy, now Pixel has used ISRO facilities for the realization of satellites and testing. And as you know, 2 weeks back, Skyroot had the first suborbital launch from Shar launchpad. And recently, Aknigul has built a launchpad at Sriharikota Space Center.
I guess the answer is, sorry, sure.
Hello. I think this question is to the young entrepreneur. See, this is something which is very important. I think geopolitics of technology is the summit, but at least what from this panel I would like to hear, you as an entrepreneur, and given that the way the globe is one, you had option of being here, US, Europe, or Israel, or wherever. What are the inherent strengths? Because unless country has an inherent strength, irrespective of the promotion and policies, we are not going to be able to succeed because it's a very competitive commercial world, correct? Whether it is VCs funding you or whatever. What do you think India's inherent strengths are because of which you chose to be in India? And what government would have to do specifically to make sure that, because I was one of the early funders of Team Indus, and I went through the shenanigans of what happened in the whole process, and funding wasn't the issue. Let me just tell you that. There are issues beyond funding. There are a lot of issues. What do you think it will take for more of you to be here? I'm not expecting SpaceX to come in 3 years or 5 years. But, with ISRO's base, can India be really at the cutting edge of technology, which is not necessarily dual use geopolitical, but for our farmers and medicine or everything else? Why would you be in India?
Yeah, so I think the answer to that is manifold. I think first and foremost, we as a country already have the space, infrastructure, expertise, and experience in the country, thanks to ISRO, right? It hasn't been privatized, but we don't have to start from scratch. We don't have to import it from elsewhere. We don't have to bring someone in from elsewhere to sort of pick that up, right? We want to build satellites, we have people that have done that. We want to build rockets, we have folks that have done that. We want to put up space stations, there are folks that are designing that, right? So first and foremost, that infrastructure is already there. We don't have to start from scratch. We don't have to put many more hundreds of millions of dollars or tens of crores, hundreds of crores back into the infrastructure because that exists. And the expertise has already built up over the past 6-7 decades. That's, I think, the biggest thing. Apart from that, what we have found is that the talent is massively, generally, not happy with just sticking to the general work that's there. We have found very passionate folks wanting to work in space technology coming in from other sectors such as automotives, EVs, and even the software sector. So I think that having access to a billion plus population where there's a significant amount of talent that can work on this and just put the energy into it becomes a big factor. And finally, what can be done to ensure that there are more here is, I think the only thing that you can do or the government can control is just being a big supporter of the space, and that can be through a couple of ways. Policy is obviously the most basic thing, but apart from that, having early sources of grant funding becomes very important. Any space sector that you see globally that has bloomed has millions of dollars worth of funding, as Sushmita earlier mentioned. Having that access means that companies don't die in the early stages. They can at least see through the technology, and then it's a matter of your market. And finally, the biggest thing is the government being the buyer for these services. The reason why SpaceX is valued what it is valued is because 90% of their revenue comes from the US government, right? Maxar, when they started, 75% of their revenue is still the US government. So having the government be a big buyer, and not only defense, not only intelligence, it could be the Ministry of Agriculture having satellites for monitoring the farmlands that are across the country, or the Ministry of Petroleum wanting to see what's really out there and what leaks are happening, or the Ministry of Climate. So I would say that could be the biggest thing that can be done to continue it.
Thank you so much.
I think with that, we'll conclude the session since we are sort of on time to start our next panel. So thank you to all the panelists for coming in and joining us, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Thanks.
Thank you.